Дорогие друзья, добрый вечер. Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to the virtual platform of the Russian House in Brussels, Europe. Добро пожаловать на виртуальную платформу Русского дома в Брюсселе. First of all, some technical details. Прежде всего, несколько технических деталей о том, как сегодня будет проходить наш вечер. Мы приветствуем всю публику. Welcome everybody to our virtual meeting, virtual evening. And please, our meeting will be done in two languages, in Russian and in English. We have simultaneous translation, so if you want to follow us in English, you should choose the English language in the globe icon on the bottom of the screen, because I will speak Russian and our guest, Mr. Gilbert Doctorow, will speak English. So if you manage both languages and if you want to follow us in the original way, so you do not choose any language. But if you want to follow us in Russian, you should choose the Russian language in the icon, globe icon in the bottom of the screen. Наш вечер сегодня будет на двух языках, на русском и на английском, с синхронным переводом. Если вы хотите слушать нас на русском языке, пожалуйста, внизу экрана есть иконка с изображением глобуса. Это языковые версии. Вы можете выбрать версию русского языка и слушать все выступление на русском языке. Но оригинальная дорожка будет на двух языках. Я буду говорить на русском языке, потому что мы все-таки в русском доме и говорим о русской книге, а ее автор, господин Гилберт Doctorow, будет представлять ее на языке оригинала, на котором она написана, то есть на английском. Поэтому, если вы владеете обоими языками, то мы приглашаем вас оставаться без перевода и слушать, и практиковать оба языка, и русский, и английский. Кроме того, мы ждем ваших вопросов, ваших комментариев, ваших выступлений. Для того, чтобы задать вопрос, есть две опции. Теперь я говорю по-русски, потому что надеюсь, что те, кто хочет нас слушать по-английски, уже переключились на дорожку синхронного перевода на английский язык. Так вот, для того, чтобы задать вопрос, а мы приглашаем вас всех задавать вопрос, есть две опции, два варианта. Во-первых, вы можете написать нам в чат, и я уже вижу приветствие от господину Гилберту Докторову, от одного из участников. И он его тоже видит. Пожалуйста, пишите в чат все вопросы и все комментарии мы будем озвучивать. И кроме того, есть кнопка, которая называется «Вопросы и ответы». Если вы напишете свой вопрос или комментарий на этой кнопке, его увидят только ведущие, то есть только мы и автор, наш специальный гость, господин Гилберт Doctorow. И, наконец, есть третья опция. Если вы хотите сделать комментарий, и я вижу уже одного человека, который поднял руку, вы можете виртуально поднять руку, кликнуть на иконку с изображением руки, и тогда мы дадим вам слово, но после выступления основного автора. Если вы хотите, чтобы сказать нам что-то сейчас, пожалуйста, сделайте это письменно, напишите это в чат. Теперь я надеюсь, что технические детали мы обсудили, и мы можем, наконец, переходить к нашему вечеру, к презентации книги Гилберта Доктороwa «Воспоминания русиста». Но прежде чем передать ему слово, я хочу представить вам Марию Мамкаеву, свою коллегу, которая подготовила сегодняшний вечер. Это руководитель библиотеки Русского дома в Брюсселе, замечательный художник и очень творческий человек, с которой наша библиотека просто ожила и получила вторую жизнь. Мы очень рады, что Мария с нами работает. Пожалуйста, Мария, расскажите немного о нашей библиотеке, потому что сегодня рассказ о книге, а книга это, конечно, будет в нашей библиотеке, вы сможете ее у нас тоже взять. Мария, вам слово.
Спасибо большое. Я рада всех приветствовать на этом замечательном событии. Огромное спасибо Гилберту Докторову, что вы смогли нам уделить время и сделать презентацию вашей книги. Я хотела бы сказать, что мы всегда ждем в нашей библиотеке, это самая крупная библиотека в Бенилюксе, у нас очень большой выбор книг, очень много книг для людей совершенно разного поколения, от самых юных до взрослой аудитории, поэтому, пожалуйста, приходите. И, конечно же, у нас будет книга Гилберта Докторова, с которой вы можете познакомиться лично, поэтому мы всегда вас ждем. Спасибо.
Большое спасибо, Мария. И действительно, мы всех ждем в библиотеке Русского дома в Брюсселе. Скажите, пожалуйста, все ли в порядке с переводом? Все нормально, все слышат, все хорошо? Если нет, пожалуйста, напишите комментарии в чат, мы постараемся их исправить. Итак, Гилберт Докторов. Господин Гилберт Докторов, мы приветствуем вас в Русском доме в Брюсселе, и мы очень рады представлять сегодня вашу книгу. Мы горды тем, что вы наш давний партнер. Вы часто делаете выступления на различных семинарах и форумах, которые организует Русский дом в Брюсселе. Вы очень интересный политолог, прекрасный историк, и теперь еще и мы гордимся тем, что ваши книги, вас как автора книг, будут в нашей библиотеке. Вы доктор русской истории, закончили Колумбийский университет, но при этом вы наш соотечественник, хотя русский язык у вас не родной. Вы его выучили, но выучили его так, что я бы никогда не подумала, что русский язык не родной. Вы прекрасно говорите по-русски, и я говорю это как преподаватель русского языка, я знаю, о чем я говорю, так, как никто бы никогда не заподозрил, что язык у вас не родной. Но это, конечно, связано и с вашей профессиональной деятельностью. Вы много лет работали в России, в Москве, вы работали в бизнесе, были генеральным менеджером многих известных американских и бельгийских компаний, но по возвращении в Европу, в Бельгию, вы стали заниматься политологической и консультационной деятельностью и принимаете участие как политолог, как консультант во многих экспертных форумах, в конференциях по международным отношениям. Вы выступаете на телевидении, в политических ток-шоу и национальном телевидении Бельгии. И не далее, как вчера, большое спасибо, вы выступали с комментарием послания президента России Федеральному собранию, с которым Владимир Владимирович Путин выступал вчера, и вы его комментировали, его международную часть. Но для нас сейчас главное – это то, что вы являетесь автором многих книг, эссе по политологии, а главное – 2 томов воспоминаний о своей деятельности в России. Я сейчас покажу на экране обложки этих книг и надеюсь, что наши зрители смогут их увидеть и найти. Ну, в данном случае это ваша книга на Амазоне. Очень интересная обложка. Можете ее сразу прокомментировать, пожалуйста?
Yes, the photograph on the cover of Volume 1, which is entitled, has a subtitle From the Ground Up, and that is meant in two senses, from the start of my life from the ground up, and from my time that I worked in Russia at the ground up, because many people have written about Russia from the top down. This cover is a prized photograph which I received in the family of my grandfather, who was a soldier. That's a Russian soldier's uniform, and the picture is taken in Manchuria in December of 1905. He was in the Manchurian front of the Russo-Japanese War. And as you see, over his right shoulder is a balalaika, over his left shoulder is his heavy coat that they wore in the front lines. So that is a family heirloom, and I explain its broader meaning in the first pages of Volume 1. Do you have the opportunity to show the Russian version of Volume 2? You can bring that up, because that will be something that I call attention to in just a minute. Well, maybe without waiting, I will proceed to start with the talk. I did have a chat note from one Nancy Moorhead, who was asking about the languages, and so perhaps not everybody in the audience understood. Oh, this is what you have in front of you on the screen is the Russian translation of Volume 2, the one that is the featured volume in today's discussion. And I'll explain in a minute how that is available to anyone who wants it, and why it has appeared so quickly ahead of a final version that will be published soon in St. Petersburg. Now I'll start my address. This talk is written. It's a written text. I use written text precisely to stay within time limits and not to stray from the rather substantial amount of material that I hope we can go through today. I just would like to comment as regards those who are listening. I got a note in chat from Nancy asking about the languages, and just for the English speakers to be sure that that globe, the icon at the right bottom of your screen, is the one that will take you to your choice of English or Russian. Now, I open this with an expression of gratitude to the Russian House for inviting me to present the books and for arranging all the technicalities of this Zoom presentation. It would be wonderful, of course, to appear in person at the Russian House auditorium, which is something that I had the pleasure of doing in the past before COVID. Yet there is an undeniable advantage to Zoom technology. First, in that the audience today extends across several countries. As I'm aware, Belgium, the United States, Russia, and even Ukraine have signed up registrants. It's also because of COVID that I have books to present tonight. The self-isolation imposed on us all by the pandemic led me to carry out a project that I had long postponed. The project of writing and publishing my memoirs goes back more than 10 years. Indeed, as you can read on the back cover of Volume 2, and you can find the back cover by looking the book up on Amazon, they show the covers. It was already in my thoughts in 1998, I have a citation from 98, when I was writing the diaries that are the basis of this book, or books. 5 years ago, I set out on the floor of my home office, from where I'm talking to you tonight, the 15 linear meters of files that went into Volume 2. But they just sat there gathering dust, with no other distractions now, and with the fear of imminent doom spurring me to act. Over several months, I spent my days transcribing the paper documents into Microsoft Word files. And from that, I distilled the material now published in the books. As an aside, to mention the 15 linear meters that are sitting on my floor, when my grandson came and saw these, he asked me, "My grandpa, how are you going to bind all of this together into a book?" Well, I think we've managed that from distillation process. In fact, there are two books. Volume 2 is what I'm going to talk about today, and that covers the period when I worked as an expatriate manager in St. Petersburg and Moscow, the years 1994 to 2002. I stress expatriate manager because this only became possible for foreigners to be resident, as the way I was, in the new Russian Federation. And we were a large community. We were 50,000 people, 50,000 families of expatriates. So this book, Volume 2, is about my adventures, but it's about the adventures of the whole community of expatriates, a substantial community. Then there's Volume 1. It was also published in this past year of the plague, in November 2020, to be precise. And it covers the period from my childhood through my college years and from my early and later job experience as a consultant and as a corporate manager, looking after business in Russia and in Eastern Europe from offshore, from offices in Brussels, in London, in Frankfurt, all the way up to 1994. I'll speak about Volume 2 today because it's the volume with the greatest interest to the broad public. The 1990s were volatile. There were dramatic changes in the economy, in domestic and foreign policy, almost weekly. The times set the stage for East-West confrontation of the 21st century, and so they have immediate relevance to today's reader. However, Volume 1 also has merits to recommend it to your attention. It helps you to understand where the author of Volume 2 came from, what intellectual baggage and life experience I brought with me to my assignments as an expatriate manager in Russia in the 1990s. And within the narrative and diaries of Volume 1, there are select moments which the general reader can enjoy. There are two high points in Volume 1 worth mentioning here. The first was the period when I headed my own consulting company and took senior executives of half a dozen major US corporations, mostly in the food processing and agricultural domains, to negotiations for major turnkey projects in the USSR. This period is 1976 to 1980. The high point within that period was my participation as a guest at the dinner in honor of Leonid Brezhnev in the Kremlin in December 1978. At that point, as a company president, I was together with America's 150 captains of industry singing "Happy Birthday, dear Leonid Ilyich" to the Secretary General of the Communist Party. The second high point in Volume 1 is the 4 years from 1989 to 1993, when I was employed by the logistics company United Parcel Service to create and then to operate a parcel delivery system in the East Bloc, what had been the East Bloc. And within this USSR, to create and to co-manage a joint venture company, delivery company, with Russia's biggest ground transportation company, the trucking firm, international trucker, Sovtransavto. My adventures traveling across the Soviet Union as far as Vladivostok, following the footsteps of my grandfather, shown in that picture on that cover of Volume 1, down to Central Asia, where Uzbekistan became our hub, and through the Baltic states and Ukraine, are recorded in diary entries which read like a time-lapse recording of the final several years of the Soviet Union, when it was in progressive dissolution and the local populations of the borderlands were trying to find new identities. Volume 2 will soon be launched in a properly edited Russian translation by the St. Petersburg publishing house Literasi. It will have a new name, not Memoirs, but Diaries of a Russianist. That name change will better reflect the true nature of these volumes. I just make an aside here to explain that the volume 2 that you've seen on the screen and which you can purchase from Amazon as a paperback book from the original publisher in the US author house as an ebook for $5. That was put out precisely to reach a Russian audience who can access it at a very low price on the internet and download it. What is about to appear in 2 months' time in Nikki Rashi is a thoroughly edited edition. And what do I mean here? The translation that you find in the book that was shown on the screen is a machine translation, which I edited myself to the best of my ability, and I corrected a lot because machine translations, however good they are today, and they are quite stunning, not only in speed but also in quality, nonetheless, they often make rather stupid mistakes. They sometimes get the sense of an expression or a sentence backwards, and you have to go through them with a fine-tooth comb and pick out these errors. Well, to the best of my ability, is good, but not perfect. And the skilled editors in Nikki Rashi are doing a very good polishing job to ensure that the Russian reader will have a text that is completely understandable. That volume also will have photographs in it, and it will take in the first 50 pages of volume 1, so that the narrative from my childhood on will be accessible. Now, many people publish memoirs. They're often written decades after the events described, and they're based on sketchy recollections. In my case, 75% of both volumes consist of diaries. A further 10% is news clippings, and the overarching narrative is placed at the start of each book to orient the reader about the blocks of time that would follow. The news clippings are quite important because, particularly in the 1990s, with this volatility and dramatic changes in the direction of government and the economy, it is good to have that sense of what was being reported generally in the world, and to match that up with what I was saying in my diaries. As a professionally trained historian with a doctorate based on research in state archives, the contents of which tend to be dry and impersonal, I knew the value of diaries very well from when I was lucky to find such diaries in collections, often library collections, university libraries. That value goes well beyond the details that our memories tend to lose much later. Rather, the greatest value is to convey the thinking of the author and of his or her interlocutors at the time of the events, without any changes that are always introduced in memoirs written much later, as our personalities evolve over time and as society's values change. In keeping with this approach, I've kept the lessons I draw from the diaries largely to myself. You will find very few generalizations in these volumes. It is up to you, the reader, to extract what you wish from the diaries depending on your interests. However, today I will violate that principle and offer to you in this presentation some of my conclusions from the diaries. These are in several dimensions worthy of note: domestic politics in Russia at the time, the challenges of doing business in Russia back then, foreign relations, and culture. Since the host of this book presentation is the Russian House, which had a subtitle of the Science and Culture Center, I think it's appropriate to begin with and to devote most of my remarks tonight to what my book tells us about Russian cultural life in the 1990s. This is all the more justified when you browse the diaries themselves and find, as I did, that a great deal of my time and attention was spent on Russian culture. I will go into that in detail in a moment, but first, the overriding conclusion that I draw from the diaries and share with you tonight in this particular dimension is that the performing arts and what we call high culture were, are, and likely will always be a defining characteristic of Russia and of Russianness. Even in the very difficult times of the 1990s, when the Russian economy had shrunk by 50%, I just compare that to the US loss of 30% of gross domestic product in the Great Depression. Anyway, at this time of great suffering, the economy was in serious loss. Russia had one of the world's richest offerings of high culture that we foreign residents, often living without our families who stayed in Europe or the States, we had the time and the interest to explore. However, as you will find in this book, I was not just a consumer of Russian culture. My work and my interests gave me the opportunity to participate in the creation of cultural events. As the general manager in Russia of multinational corporations, at a time when sales were in the hands of our local business partners, not run directly by our employees, and when most strategic direction was given by corporate headquarters in London or in New York, not by people in the field like myself, I had primary responsibility for public and government relations, for brand image, not for daily sales. This was all the more true during the years 1998 to 2000, when I was working for United Distillers Diageo, the world's largest liquor company then and today. Since the number one issue facing the company in Russia was the challenge to its ownership of the Smirnoff vodka brand by a local offshoot of the Smirnoff family, Boris, who set up his own production of vodka. His legal challenge was not only intended to drive Smirnoff off the Russian market, which he successfully did, but also to collect billions of dollars in damages for the sale of Smirnoff around the world on the basis of wrongly claimed ownership. Since you have seen a lot of vodka brands on supermarket shelves, allow me to explain that in the period under review, Smirnoff was the world's best-selling vodka and the second best-selling hard liquor brand after Bacardi rum. Besides the law courts, the defense of Smirnoff was carried out in the domain of public and government relations, which I answered for. Sponsorship in the arts was and is an important tool of public relations in the luxury goods sector. I was given a relatively free hand in choosing where and on what to spend the funds entrusted to me for these purposes. For those of you unfamiliar with the workings of international business and who may believe that sponsorship is a crassly commercial activity motivated directly by profit targets, let me inform you that the relationship between a sponsor and beneficiary is much more subtle and mutually advantageous. I'll explain that in detail in a moment. First, I want to stress that sponsorship activities which I oversaw were generally on a limited budget. There are exceptions, of course. Indeed, when I was a general manager for United Distillers Diageo, my single biggest project was not cheap. I headed the board of the Russian Booker Literary Prize because my company paid the bills of the competition. And those bills came to about $200,000 per year. Of this amount, $15,000 went to the first laureate of the prize. The rest went into supporting and building out the infrastructure of the competition. The announcement of the long list, the announcement of the short list, with their related press conferences. They entailed generous hospitality for journalists, but then there was the awards dinner, which was organized on a lavish scale. We engaged the main ballroom of the Metropole Hotel in downtown Moscow, opposite the Bolshoi Theater. We entertained our guests with a chamber orchestra conducted by a deputy to Mariinsky Theater's general conductor, Valery Gergiev, and appearances were made by known stars, including at that time Bolshoi Theater tenor Nikolai Baskov, who is today a leading television personality. He may not be an opera star, but he is a crooner, and you'll see him at every New Year's celebration on Russian television. Otherwise, however, I was able to achieve considerable impact with spending far less money. This was all the more possible in St. Petersburg, where I chose to hold many of our sponsorship events, precisely because they could be executed there at 10 times less than in Moscow. In 1996-97, on behalf of my employer, the Canadian liquor company Seagram & Sons, I arranged to sponsor 4 concerts of the St. Petersburg Philharmonic Society to mark the 75th anniversary of their founding. These were events with high visibility in St. Petersburg, and for them I was able to purchase tickets for our VIP guests, including government officials of importance to our business, such as the head of the city's customs office, the directors of our main importers and distributors with their wives. At one concert, the star performer was the singer, the opera singer Barbara Hendricks, who was then in great demand across the world. At another concert, the conductor was Sir Gilbert Doctorow, who was well known in the States from his time at Chicago Symphony and in Europe at London Opera House. Our contribution to each concert was just $2,000, plus the liquor, which was the cognac, champagne, fine wines, which were offered free of charge to guests who came to the concert, as the whole audience of the concert, in the foyer of the Philharmonic. By an agreement with the managers of the magnificent Grand Hotel Europe across the street from the Philharmonic, we hosted post-concert receptions for elite performers, which were highly appreciated. I might explain that such receptions after concerts for the conductor, for the soloists, were a well-established tradition in Russia before the revolution. And it was a great pleasure to revive that tradition in the 1990s. Another key cultural event for which I arranged sponsorship was also done jointly with the management of the St. Petersburg Philharmonic. This was the first ever performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk. It was known till then only in the censored version, Ekaterina Ismailova. This was to celebrate the anniversary of Shostakovich's birth. The performances, 2 in Moscow and 2 in St. Petersburg, under the direction of Mstislav Shostakovich, had national importance. They cost us a total of $20,000. In Moscow, the proceeds of ticket sales were contributed to the reconstruction of the Christ the Savior Church, a project which enjoyed patronage of Mayor Luskov, so that the donation made business sense in terms of our visibility before the authorities. I don't mean to suggest that all events sponsored by major international companies in St. Petersburg were cheap. On the same day as we had our concert with Sir Gilbert Doctorow at the Philharmonic, Mercedes-Benz sponsored the performance in the Mariinsky Theater of the Berlin Philharmonic under the baton of Claudia Abbado. That must have cost Mercedes several $100,000 to bring the entire orchestra to St. Petersburg and to host VIP guests in loges of the Mariinsky Theater at $600 per loge. And you add to that the cost of the direct broadcast of the concert to Germany for the German television. Nonetheless, my point is that brand building activities in public and government relations do not have to be very expensive in cash, though they are very demanding of management time. The best payback is what I heard from the editor-in-chief of St. Petersburg literary journal Zvezda after one of our sponsored concerts. He said, I'm speaking of Yasha Gordon, I see that your company, Seagram's, not only comes here to take, but also to give back to Russian society. That is what every sponsor wants to hear. It takes 2 to tango, and I wish to point out that especially in Petersburg, we had very good partners in the general director Anton Getman of the Philharmonic Society and in the Mariinsky Theater, where we established excellent relations with the intendant Schwarzkopf. Over the course of the 6 years I was working in Moscow from major corporate offices, my cultural activities began primarily in music, then moved to literature, and finally to drama theater. Aside from financial affordability, the further reason for concentrating on music in St. Petersburg rather than Moscow was at this time the Mariinsky Theater of Opera and Ballet, under the musical direction of Valery Gergiev, was unquestionably the leading house of music in the whole country. After the forced departure of choreographer Grigorovich, who was the main personality in the Bolshoi, until then, the Bolshoi was left in disarray and was ruled by committee. In the 1990s, the Mariinsky Theater was my second home, and this is clear in the diary entries. Our closest friends in St. Petersburg were the Kaladins. Sergei was one of a handful of conductors performing in the orchestra pit several times a week, and also taking the orchestra on some foreign tours. And he took them to China, he took them to Slovenia, and other places, also in the metropolitan. There were a small group, a handful of such assistant conductors who were working with Gergiev, who prepared performances which he would then stand and conduct. And so Sergei was in the theater almost every day of the week, and he very generously invited us to join him in the director's loge. So Larissa, my wife, and I went several times a week to performances in Mariinsky. He also introduced us to his circle of friends among opera singers. I name here Victor Chernomortsev and Sergei Naido. They were known in Europe and in the Metropolitan Opera in New York. All of these get-togethers are recorded in my diaries and are reproduced in the book. Well, not, shouldn't say all, but a great many. The Mariinsky meant still more to us. For a couple of years, we rented an apartment from the first and second viola players in the orchestra, the Safarovs, and they invited us to their dacha, which Seva built in an artistic community outside of Petersburg. We went to the debut performance in the conservatory of their violinist daughter, who today is second violin in the Mariinsky orchestra. Now a word about my involvement with Russian literature in the 1990s, or to be more exact, during the years 1998 to 2002, when I was the chairman of what was then Russia's most prestigious private literary award, the Russian Booker Prize. For the first 2 years of my chairmanship, my position was directly attributable to my employment with the prize's general sponsor. However, after my departure from United Distillers Diageo in 2000, I was kept on as chairman at the request of the UK Booker Prize. This was in recognition of the substantial work I had been doing to expand the activities of the prize in Russia and to bring it into line with the formula for success that had made the UK Booker Prize the world's leading literary competition, attracting the attention of the British middle and upper classes and yielding book sales of the laureates on the order of hundreds of thousands of copies. When I came to the Russian Booker, this is the offshoot that was set up by the founder of the UK Booker, it appeared to need excitement, something to capture popular imagination, which is exactly what the UK Booker was all about. We also, and unlike the UK, we had to do some work with the publishing industry and with booksellers to revive the supports to literature which had collapsed together with the Russian economy from the late 1980s into the 1990s. In this regard, with the assistance of the British Embassy, we arranged events bringing together these critical contributors or stakeholders in literary production and consumption. The lady general manager of Dom Knigi in St. Petersburg, Samakhvalova, was a strong supporter of these initiatives. When I joined the Russian Booker, not a single novel nominated for the prize was actually published as a self-standing book. They all had appeared only in literary journals. We paid for the retrospective publication of the past laureates as hardbound volumes. Adding well-known authors to the advisory committee that oversaw the awards process was one task to raise the visibility of the prize. In this regard, I can name one outstanding writer who joined at our invitation, the satirist Vladimir Voinovich. Still more important was the addition of popular personalities from the arts to the jury. This was in line with what the UK Booker had long done. The fact that the Booker jury changes every year was a key part of their success formula. This is intended to ensure that the personal taste of the permanent jury is not the determinant of winners year after year. With changing juries, recognition is given to the highest quality in various literary trends. Thus, together with the advisory committee, I brought onto the jury Dmitry Bergman, an enfant terrible, the director of the fashionable boutique opera house, very much loved by Moscow intelligentsia, the Helicon Opera. We also brought the filmmaker Valery Todorovsky and actor Sergeyevsky. These appointments are also out in the diary. Of course, everything comes to an end, and when Diageo wound down its funding of the Booker in 2002, and a local sponsor stepped in, the Open Russia Foundation of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, it was time to turn over the chairmanship to a Russian and for me to move on. However, the moment of transition was by itself unexpectedly interesting, and I recorded in my diary, I've published in volume 2, a verbatim account of my meeting with the new, shall we call them, owners of the Russian Booker. That meeting sets out a clear rebuttal to anyone who says that Mikhail Khodorkovsky stood for civil society in Russia. Quite the contrary. He and his foundation had no respect for the free jury, and they behaved like authoritarians. Thus, in 2003, the winner of the Russian Booker Prize was dictated by none other than Mikhail Khodorkovsky himself, who overrode the jury and issued the winner's name from the prison cell where he was then. In Moscow, there was still another cultural establishment with whom I brought my employers into a sponsorship relationship. I have in mind Yuri Lyubimov and his Taganka Theater. This is also in the same period of 1998-2002. Our, quote, sponsorship contribution consisted of wine and hard liquor for their frequent receptions in the theater. The Taganka Theater was a major social institution in Moscow under Yuri Lyubimov. So with our help, the theater management was able to be generous hosts to visitors of great importance. For example, the Lady President of Finland, or when they hosted the 80th birthday celebrations on stage for Alexander Solzhenitsyn, to which, by the way, Yuri Lushkov, mayor of Moscow, came and made his personal contribution on stage. I was at these events and I took my notes of these extraordinary days, and you will find them in volume 2. At such events, it's expected that luxury beverages will be served with the buffet table food. However, under rules of the Russian state treasury, institutions receiving government funding, like the Taganka Theater, were not allowed to spend money on liquor. We helped them out of this embarrassment repeatedly and regularly, and in return, we were invited to the inner sanctums of the Taganka. I think of the gatherings in Yuri's offices where we could meet some very interesting personalities, as for example, the oligarch Boris Berezovsky. He was invited in to see Yuri since the latest show, then in rehearsals, was made possible by money from the award Triumph that Berezovsky sponsored. It was a revelation to see that Berezovsky, who was flattered by Katalina Lyubimova as, quote, the brain in the room, could not remember. Yuri was slightly offended. She allowed that he was the talent in the room. In any case, Berezovsky could not remember her name. And when he was proposing a toast, he addressed her as Yuri's companion for life. These and similar notable events were again captured in the diaries. I mention here that Yuri Lyubimov first entered my consciousness in 1972 when my future bride, Larisa Zalesova, talked our way into the sold-out Taganka performance of Hamlet that was starring the already then famous and celebrated bard Vladimir Vysotsky. We were given places on the stairs. Then I had my first meeting in person with Lyubimov at the end of the 1980s when he was living in exile, based in Jerusalem, traveling the world, and largely employed by opera houses, including nearby Bonn. He was here in Brussels for a couple of days, staying with the dissident writer-publisher Maximov, Maximov was in close working relations with Solzhenitsyn, and Maximov owned a house in Forêt, one of the boroughs of Brussels. I drove Lyubimov down to Namur for a day of mushroom hunting. And these events you'll find in the memoirs. Doing business in Russia. When I arrived in Russia to live and work in 1994, there were at the time, as I said, 50,000 expatriate managers and their families. Some in senior positions who were of my age, many others were quite young, 15 or 20 years younger than myself. Many came to Russia to study, or many of these people came to study. They took language courses. They saw opportunities, once they arrived, to get good jobs immediately, and they stayed to make their fortunes. I write about this cohort in the chapter of volume 2 entitled, Who Were We, the Expatriates? I point out here that many of the young foreigners were highly talented and were not just unprincipled opportunists. There were those who came to pursue vacancies in their chosen field and to get invaluable experience in a major emerging market. This concerns journalists in particular. It's worth mentioning that the current Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, was in the late 1990s a reporter based in Moscow for the Financial Times. And her articles on different facets of life in Russia were published several times a week. There were also some very smart journalists in what I call the underground English language press, titles like The Exile, which I think gives you a hint at their tongue-in-cheek approach. These people told the truth as they saw it about political life and about the hypocrisies of the foreign community, among others. As regards doing business, the generalization I offer today is that it was difficult, very difficult, almost impossible to do business legally in Russia in the mid-1990s. The picture of Russia as a normal country governed by law that the big accounting firms were presenting to the headquarters of multinational corporations was nothing more than a Potemkin village that contradicted the chaotic reality. The problem was not an absence of law, although to be sure there were whole domains such as share trading, truth in advertising, and so forth, where the law did not yet reach. The bigger problem was the body of law that was inherited from the communist past and that was in flagrant contradiction with the market economy that was being introduced. This was the legacy of 70 years of communism and was based on the assumption that all private business was run by criminals. Hence, there were restrictions on all business transactions. The central bank forced the commercial banks to act as policemen. Both income and expenses of more than a few dollars had to be justified each time to the bank managers. The situation was simply impossible. You couldn't do business in cash, something which our Belgian viewers will find familiar. But the situation in Russia was very complex. You couldn't do business in cash. And so much business, and particularly in the street markets, could only be done like that. And so the intermediary companies popped up who turned bank transfers into cash for a percentage. Was this legal? Oh, marginal. And we all had to deal with it. Privatization was uppermost in the minds of Russia's reformers and their Western bankers, that it did not address this critical dimension of a market economy in formation, the anti-business nature of the Russian body of law. Western mainstream media and Western politicians spoke of Russia's problems as being the mafia and corruption. These were lesser evils. Meanwhile, the Western consultants arriving on assignments for the US government and European community agencies were often abusing their fiduciary responsibilities when serving as advisors to the Russian reforms, and they were engaging, in some very important cases, in their own corruption. And I discussed this in the diary notes, backed up by news clippings. The further problem facing business, both foreign and local business, was a never-ending flow of new decrees and regulations that were supposed to implement law, but in fact took the place of law. The many years of war between the president, Yeltsin, and the Duma meant that there was no proper legislation during the whole time. The decrees were often contradictory and confusing. Some were issued ex post facto, and they changed as power shifted to and fro among Yeltsin's entourage between reformers and conservatives. The alcoholic beverage industry in which I worked for most of the period, 1994 to 2000, was one of the most criminalized in all of the Russian economy. It was also highly politicized. Taxes on liquor had accounted for about 30% of the Russian state budget in the days of the Soviet Union. Taxes on liquor were still 23% when the Soviet Union collapsed. That is to say, liquor was as important to the Russian state then as gas and oil are today. For that reason, taxes and regulations governing the alcohol industry were a point of contention among the politicians at the time. I was following closely the political fortunes of Anatoly Chubais back then because his policies on the alcohol industry were of decisive importance to our daily work. Hence the extensive diary notes on who was who in the presidential administration. These may not be of interest to every reader, I acknowledge, but they will have importance for historians of the period. Russian domestic politics. As I leafed through my diaries, I found many entries reporting on speeches behind closed doors delivered by leading Russian politicians of the day. For example, the governor of Novgorod Oblast, Mikhail Kusak, or the deputy minister of finance, or the head of the tax administration. But the speakers were not only members of government, federal and provincial levels. They also included important people from the State Duma, such as the chairman of the Committee on Taxation. These gatherings were often organized by the American Chamber of Commerce in Moscow, which, despite its name, was the largest business club of all international companies doing business in Russia, not just American companies. Then there was also the Industrial Association gatherings that I attended, such as those organized by the alcohol producers and bottlers, Rosalco. They were busy preparing to lobby the government to save the industry, which in 1996 was operating at only 10% of capacity, for a number of reasons that the government could remedy if it took an interest. At these meetings, the leading figures of government responsible for excise taxes and other issues of vital importance to the industry itself. What emerges from my diary entries is in direct contradiction with what we're accustomed to think about the domestic political situation in Russia during the Yeltsin years, namely that a reformist-minded executive was in never-ending conflict with a communist-dominated legislature and was compelled to use presidential decrees to get things done. What I saw before me was very often incompetent or wholly impractical people from the ministries and presidential administration, and, on the contrary, very competent and patriotic legislatures from the Duma, who knew their economics very well. And while we in the West celebrated the liberal reformer Boris Nemtsov for the supposed economic miracle in Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, which never happened in fact, the quietly efficient and business-friendly governor of Novgorod Oblast, situated between St. Petersburg and Moscow, had captured several of the country's biggest manufacturing investments, including the Cadbury Schweppes chocolate factory in Estimirol, chewing gum factory, And that was all thanks to focused assistance to overcome bureaucratic obstacles in such matters as fire inspection and housing for workers and so forth. Prusak did not offer tax breaks, and that did not diminish his attractiveness to foreign investors. Then there is the issue of good and evil in the Russian political world, a never-ending refrain in Western commentary on Russia up to the present. Those Russian politicians who provided favors to Western businesses were by definition reformers, and their opponents were by definition retrogrades, Neanderthals. However, as one sharp-tongued political analyst writing in the underground English language press in Moscow observed in his commentary on Boris Nemtsov as a phony liberal and a de facto defender of the status quo, we Westerners always painted Russian political fights as between good and evil, and most often they were, like political contests everywhere, a fight over power and the perquisites of holding office, and not much more. We very easily forget that in the 1990s, nearly all of those occupying office within government or elected to office by popular vote were former communists with the same education and the same life experience. Liberals, liberal Democrats, took to authoritarian behavior and to corruption once in power like ducks to water. The reality was that Russia was ruled by presidential decree and by implementing regulations. There was a constant flow of regulation from top down, and this made it quite difficult for all businessmen, both foreigners and Russians, to navigate this ever-changing legislative environment. International relations. Of course, my diary and news clippings record the developing international relations and the growing alienation of Russia from the US-led international community. Russia's liberation from Western tutelage was signaled by the retirement of Mr. Yes, the Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev, who received that designation, Mr. Yes, in contrast to the long-standing Soviet head of Foreign Ministry, Andrei Gromyko, who was Mr. Net. Anyway, Mr. Kozyrev was replaced by Yevgeny Primakov, who was a serious defender of Russia's national interests. What is less noted in Western accounts of the period, but what impressed me was how the Duma elections of 1995 and the emergence of strong nationalist and pro-communist voters fed the argument in the West that Russia might turn from a liberal democratic path, and so NATO and the argument would protect against any insurgent Russia. That was, of course, quite unfortunate, and it had as its ultimate consequence precisely what it was supposed to prevent, the emergence of a strong nation in the Russian Federation. I speak of several turning points in relations between the West and Russia in this period, and one is the murder of Paul Tatum in November 1996. Tatum was the founder and owner of the first American owned and managed hotel in Russia, the Radisson Slavyanskaya, and it was a hotel and business center complex. His gangland style execution, he was murdered by dozens of bullets from a Kalashnikov just outside his hotel business center. And that showed Western businessmen how they were vulnerable and how they were exposed to the very same dangers that Russian businessmen and bankers had long experienced, where corporate disputes were settled in gun battles and not in the courts. And that was a shock to the entire business community. I close this address with a remark. But these, I've told you some of the highlights of volume 2. The book is vast, it's nearly 800 pages, and no doubt every reader will find what interests him or her most and will skip material that is outside the focus of interest. I do not expect that the average reader will go through the book word for word, page for page. But I do believe there is enough variety to satisfy both specialists who will use this book in university courses, as well as a primary source, and the general readers who want to learn about those fateful years in Russia from a very personal perspective of someone whose feet were on the ground and had the advantage of being an outsider, recording the views of the expatriate community, as well as of Russians in all levels of society. So thank you very much for your attention.
Спасибо вам большое, Гилберт Докторов, за такой взгляд изнутри и снаружи, я могу сказать, потому что я как человек русский, россиянка, я жила в это время в России, впрочем, как и в другое время, но вот эти ревущие 90-е, или как мы русских называем лихие 90-е, да, ну, есть и другие, менее литературные названия, я их помню очень хорошо. И мне, конечно, было очень интересно слушать вас с точки зрения действительно приближенности к нашему восприятию. И вот первое впечатление, которое у меня сложилось от того, что вы говорили, это то, что вы, с одной стороны, смотрели на эту ситуацию глазами иностранца, иностранного специалиста, конечно, американца, и человека западной культуры, но с другой стороны, те оценки, которые вы давали сейчас, они очень во многом совпадают с оценками нашими, людей, которые в это время жили и работали в этой стране, в России. Поэтому я бы сказала, что ваш взгляд на Россию 90-х – это взгляд и снаружи, и изнутри. Я очень под многими вашими идеями, вашими мыслями и вашими выводами могла бы подписаться. Но у нас есть много вопросов. Теперь я передаю слово аудитории, нашим участникам. Пожалуйста, задавайте вопросы. И у нас есть вопросы, которые к нам поступили еще до начала нашего вечера. Вот, пожалуйста, первый вопрос, который есть, касается культурной части вашего анализа. Приглашали ли вы знаменитого, замечательного русского баритона Дмитрия Хворостовского на свои мероприятия, на свои культурные акции?
Regrettably, no. He was at that time outside our radar screen. There were many notable performers, and as I said, I received, or we both received, because Larissa was an important part of this bridge to the Russian cultural world. We received invitations to events, and we were very much helped, as I mentioned in my talk, by a few people who brought us into their circle. And so the acquaintances we made were limited in that way. There surely were many other outstanding people, and you have mentioned one. He's a remarkable singer, a great talent, and an enormous loss. It was untimely death. But there were others of outstanding quality in this period. I mentioned some of them in other spheres because their names would not necessarily be known to a Western audience. And indeed, I have to admit that one of the reasons for a Russian edition is that I imagine there will be, as in your own case, people who lived through that period and who in Russia who know very well many of the people I named who were important within Russia and as both they gave to the country in terms of their talent, but did not necessarily have international careers, at least not in the period that I'm talking about. Of course, Rostos did later on. But for this reason, I expect that both in Moscow, in particular in St. Petersburg, because a number of the personalities in the political world that I speak about extensively are Petersburgers, there will be greater understanding for these, for my treatment of these personalities who are well known locally and who may not be so familiar in Western Europe or the United States or elsewhere around the globe. So the piquancy or the particular personal impressions that I share will have less impact, unfortunately, for them. But I expect in Petersburg and Moscow they will be well known in the future. People will compare notes about those comments.
Да, спасибо большое. Есть несколько вопросов, скажем так, немножко провокационных. Ведь вы работали в сфере, связанной с алкоголем, в любой стране и в любое время. Эта сфера, скажем так, близка к криминализации. Насколько в безопасности вы себя чувствовали, насколько вы были в безопасности, вы и ваши сотрудники, были ли у вас конфликты или угрозы со стороны криминальных структур, и приходилось ли вам разговаривать с ними на их языке, другими словами, были ли вы подвергнуты рэкету?
Well, I do. I have a gallery of rogues, and at the back of volume 2, I speak about some personalities more extensively than I could have done in the introduction to the book or in the diaries themselves. And one of them is one of the cutthroats whom I had to do business with. Although I call him a cutthroat, he was a man who made an extraordinary career and became the owner of a bank in Petersburg, became the owner of the biggest cellulose factory in northwestern Russia, almost became the owner of Petersburg. And yet, in the period when I had to deal with him, 1995, 1996, going to his den, I call it a den, office.
Но вы остались живы, и все в порядке.
It was intimidating, and it was meant to be intimidating. With his short-necked and very wide-chested assistants, that's in attending meetings with, say, managers of Seagram who came over from London to try to collect debts. He very quickly ensured that they were happier to forgive and forget than to try to pursue actively the debt collection. And there are some meetings I had in Moscow with one of the former distributors of Absolute Vodka, because I was in more than one well-known vodka in my career in Moscow. And in my time with Seagrams, we were representing Absolute, the Swedish manufacturer. And they had distributors, and they said, we'd like to go and visit them and see how we can reestablish some sort of contact with them. Well, I did. And I was very happy to get out alive because there was a paranoia in the office of this representative. However, we felt, as expatriates, we felt, at least until the murder of Paul Tatum, we felt rather safe. I have to be honest about it. My employees did not feel safe. And I had, when I had some candidates for employment, one of them backed out after he was given an offer. He said, my wife told me better not. You, Doctorow, you can leave on the first plane out. I can't. And so, yes, they were genuinely concerned about being pursued by mafia. But you don't have to be in the liquor industry to feel that. And as I say at the outset of my book, I didn't just come into Russia going to work for Seagrams or Diageo. I came into Russia working in a much more innocent industry, jeans. My first job as an expatriate in Petersburg and Moscow was for the company Mustang Bekleidungswerke in south of Germany, who had built a factory outside of Petersburg, in a suburb of Petersburg. And they wanted to set up a sales company. And I took it for them. I can tell you right now, the first encounter that I had with the Russian mafia, it was precisely in this very modest, extremely modest office that we set up on the Sierskoye Street. And we didn't hear from the mafia until we went out and bought a desk. So buying a desk put us on their radar screen. And when I was absent for several weeks from Petersburg to pick up a car here in Belgium, a Lada, which I was taking back to Petersburg as a company car, my employees were threatened by a gang of mafia in our district, a shakedown to try to get protection money from us. And that was my first experience with the German consulate and others to learn how you deal with this. What was the answer? And of course, there were solutions. You paid money not to the mafia, you paid money to security agencies, who then paid money to the mafia. So you were one remove from this as a Western company. But in point of fact, there were many gangland murders. One of them took place.
Ну, видимо, эта цепочка действует в большинстве стран.
Okay. Yes. I also have to say that the liquor industry is criminalized, or was criminalized in many countries, not just in Russia. And among the most successful people whom I met doing business in Russia were people who had experience with organized labor of the criminal variety. I think now of the American longshoremen, who were a major factor against which companies like United Parcel had to deal, or which Maersk's company Sealand had to deal with. People, the most successful managers were often people who had experience in labor disputes, which are at the edge of criminality also, by the way, and who were not intimidated and who knew how to deal straight with these people and to achieve some kind of modus vivendi.
Скажите, пожалуйста, ну, когда говорят о России 90-х, вопрос о криминалитете всегда бывает одним из первых. Мы вам его тоже задали, и возвращаться к нему не будем, потому что вы на него ответили очень полно и исчерпывающе. Давайте поговорим о другом. Все-таки Россия 90-х – это, скажем так, время родов. Да? Это время, когда закончилась одна Россия, и еще не появилась другая. И вот этот процесс рождения новой России, новой страны, он был трудным, как любые роды, он был мучительным, там было много проблем. И мы сейчас говорим вот о том самом периоде, когда еще не было, уже не было старого, но еще не было нового, и это новое только появлялось в муках, мучительно. Но тем не менее, этот период дал ту Россию, в которой мы сейчас живем, все стабилизировалось. Те, кто был в России в 90-е годы и едет туда сейчас, понимают, что это две разные страны, абсолютно разные, несравнимые, но зачатки этой новой России появились, конечно, тогда. И тогда же были истории успеха. История успеха и русских фирм, и западных фирм. Вот скажите, пожалуйста, какие истории успеха, настоящего бизнес-успеха, вы можете вспомнить из 90-х годов? Те, которые дали нормальную, устойчивую экономику уже в нулевых годах, в десятых и так далее.
There were companies that had global reputations and global prominence, who moved into Russia, invested heavily, and succeeded. I think of Procter & Gamble, but I don't talk about Procter. I only speak in the book about companies with which I had a personal insight because I had met with their leading managers and understood from the inside how and why they succeeded. I'll mention two of them here. One was Sealand, the transportation logistics company, shipping company, the first container shipping company in the world, which is since the end of the 90s became a part of the global shipping company, the Danish shipping company, Maersk. And I was the most serious candidate, and the only candidate at the end, to succeed their general manager, Jack Helton, as the general manager of Sealand in Russia. And so I met repeatedly over a period of 6 months with top management of Sealand in Moscow, in Rotterdam, and in Charlotte in the States, their headquarters in the States. And I saw from the inside what they had achieved for the benefit of Russian logistics. They were developers of the Trans-Eurasian Railway container shipments that we know today and that China has been using very recently during the pandemic. The single responsibility and high technology shipping by the Trans-Siberian Railway was largely organized administratively by Sealand. They also had a project in St. Petersburg. They had a project for intermodal transport in Moscow. They, in the course of 4 or 5 years, Jack Helton raised their business from $1 or $2 million to $200 million. Sealand was then the main container company that was servicing St. Petersburg from the world. They took nearly all of the American exports, those famous Bush chicken legs and American tobacco and liquor, that as well as products from all the rest of the world, were transported from Sicily. What was the secret of their success? It was they hired a mature manager from within, a man who didn't speak a word of Russian, to be honest with you. And this was against my predisposition to think that a fluent Russian speaker, or at least a Russian speaker, with some knowledge of the locale, would be a better candidate. Well, Jack was just the opposite. He did not speak Russian. He had some very capable Russian administrative assistants who did interpret for him. But the main thing is that he enjoyed the confidence of the home office, and he was given rarely, on rare occasion, he was given very extensive powers to decide and set strategy on his own, without going back to headquarters for their decision made on the basis of poor knowledge and extraneous factors. So as a man who was trusted, I trusted in a very qualified way. The rule was succeed and we're with you, fail and you're on your own.
Понятно. Вот это, кстати...
Yes. He succeeded. Another example, and I'll like the second one, the only two that I can want to produce here, was an Indian company, an Indian family company that had done business in Russia for years before, in the 1990s, and invested in the beer business. They set up they bought breweries. And they were called Sun Brewing. They bought eventually 7 different breweries, regional breweries, which were hard to manage because harder to manage than a centralized brewery, modern brewery, such as Carlsberg eventually bought out in St. Petersburg, in what we know today as Baltica, with one main brewery serving our country. Well, he bought 7, and then there was a lot of negotiation to do with local governors and a lot of politics. And their local manager, again, who was not a Russian speaker, but had experience in substantial business experience, and was given freedom to manage. He grew this business to the point where it was 17% of the whole Russian beer consumption was satisfied by Sun Brewers. At the end of the 90s, they were bought out by the Belgians. They became part of the empire of Stella. Now, these 2 incidents, I raise them because, as you find when you go through my diary, the issue of relations between the man on the spot, the man in the field, such as I was, and corporate headquarters, That was a very tricky question. And very few major corporations, which are always large hierarchies, had the wisdom, I call it wisdom, to entrust the day-to-day management and even the setting of corporate strategy to a seasoned manager on the ground. Most of when managers on the ground had success, they often found themselves in conflict with managers in headquarters who wanted to take credit for that success and to freeze out those who brought the success. This was not my personal experience only, it was a very widespread phenomenon, and I did discuss it in some detail. So I think that my book should have substantial interest for business school students, for those who are looking to start careers in emerging markets, major emerging markets. Because what happened then in Russia in the 1990s was not unique or exceptional. There are many issues that you'll find elsewhere in the world.
Спасибо. У нас есть вопрос, точнее комментарий, один очень личный. Пересекались ли вы в России с журналистом Александром Меркушевым? Ну, наверное, вы ответите на этот вопрос его автору. Можно это сделать письменно через наш чат. И есть еще один интересный комментарий от господина Франко Спарталари. О том, он говорит, что он уже прочитал первый том, но еще не читал второй. Но объем и качество ваших заметок об этом уникальном месте, об этой уникальной стране и времени действительно является источником очень ценной информации об этом периоде. И ваше изучение истории, ваше понимание России, ее культуры действительно отличает вас от большинства менеджеров, работающих там в то время, и делает ваши комментарии очень проницательными. Мне кажется, что это очень правильный комментарий. Действительно, он перекликается и с тем, что я недавно вам сказала, мое личное впечатление о вашем понимании России. Но, к сожалению, у нас много еще очень вопросов, и мы не задали, наверное, половины тех вопросов, которые у нас есть, но, к сожалению, время тоже у нас выходит. Мы уже почти 1,5 часа ведем эту встречу, и, к сожалению, надо будет ее заканчивать. Мы всех приглашаем ознакомиться с вашими книгами, приобрести ваши книги в интернете или в книжном магазине. Мы очень ждем, что они появятся в нашей библиотеке, и мы сможем давать их почитать нашим читателям, потому что мы и не должны сейчас рассказать всю вашу книгу на этой встрече, чтобы люди все-таки читали ее и сами знакомились с теми фактами и с теми выводами, которые вы в них делаете. Но для завершения я хотела бы задать вам классический вопрос, который задают иностранцам, бизнесменам, работающим или работавшим в России, как вы. Какие, ну такой, знаете, кусочек кросс-культурного консалтинга. Какими качествами должен обладать бизнесмен для того, чтобы быть успешным в русском бизнесе, и какие качества русского бизнеса, русской деловой культуры были вам полезны в вашей работе в России?
It's a very interesting question. The problem, and the question goes much farther than business alone. It really has to do also with our relations on a national level and diplomacy. And what I experienced, as I said, was that a certain openness and an interest to understand the other side was essential. One of the biggest problems that business encountered, the business that I was involved in encountered, was that in our relations with Russian industrial partners, the Home Office was not really listening to the Russian counterparty and did not trust and didn't understand that the Russian party understood far better what was legally and politically possible than the law firms that were being retained at enormous cost by the Home Office to guide them. So we lost business opportunities because the Home Office was producing its own scenarios of what the relationship with the Russian partner should look like, and was not listening to what Russian law and Russian practice and political winds in Russia were telling us. As I said, in this respect, business is no different from politics. And what I saw around me then in the 1990s, in this particular respect, remains unfortunately quite relevant to what is going on day by day today in East-West relations. There was very little listening going on. And it is essential if any agreements of substance are to be reached.
С вами согласна абсолютно. Надо слышать друг друга, надо слушать друг друга. Главное – это культурная открытость и готовность услышать не только свою правду, но и правду партнера. И тогда и бизнес будет честным, и отношения будут здоровыми, и, собственно, все будет нормально, если выходить из своей раковины и относиться к своему партнеру как к ближнему, как к самому себе.
If I may add just one other point. My experience going back to the 1970s, the Soviet Union was twice the population of the Russian successor state. Russia was maybe 10 or 15% bigger geography before the Russian Federation emerged from the Soviet Union. But it was a big country, and it was a big country after it became the Russian Federation. And particularly multinational corporations had very big expectations of what could be achieved in sales and profit in that country. These expectations very often were unrealistic. They were the result of competition between managers in the Home Office, where nobody was looking at the facts on the ground. And that again is a feature of doing business in Russia from going back to the 1970s, certainly to the 1990s, that has relevance to how we conduct international affairs today. There has to be an element of reason and a proper measure to our expectations, and not just our ambitions and our wishes.
Да, конечно, с этим трудно не согласиться, и, наверное, это мысль, на которой нам нужно закончить сегодняшний разговор. Очень не хочется, потому что есть много вопросов, и у меня есть несколько вопросов, как у человека, жившего в России в 90-е годы. Мне хотелось бы задать вам несколько вопросов, тоже довольно конкретных, но, может быть, они будут не очень интересны нашей аудитории, поэтому я сделаю это, наверное, в личном разговоре с вами. А сейчас я хочу процитировать еще один комментарий, который благодарит вас за очень интересную презентацию. Мы все вас благодарим и, во-первых, за ваш труд, за эти 2 тома. Единственное, как филолог, я тоже доктор, но филологии, а не истории, хотела бы сказать, что я не согласна с переводом названия вашей книги на русский язык. И вы знаете, конечно, почему. Потому что для нас слово «русист» означает специалист по русскому языку и литературе. А вы гораздо шире. Вы специалист по России. И я бы перевела название вашей книги как «Записки или воспоминания специалиста по России». Это правильно по смыслу было бы, но видимо, у вас были свои причины, почему был дан именно такой перевод, воспоминания русиста, значит, это ваше право как автора. Но, тем не менее, я хочу сказать, что то, что вы написали, это действительно воспоминания, дневники, записки очень хорошего специалиста по России, и поэтому мы, конечно, можем вас за это благодарить и надеяться, что вы будете продолжать свой труд и напишите, может быть, еще 3-й том, и мы приглашаем вас в наш русский центр в Брюсселе, если вы напишите еще один текст или другую книгу, обязательно представите ее на нашей или виртуальной, или мы будем надеяться уже реальной, нормальной площадке. Ждем вас с вашими новыми литературными произведениями. Дорогие друзья, я хочу поблагодарить всех коллег, которые помогали нам сегодня для организации этого вечера. Прежде всего, Марию Мамкаеву. Мария, скажите тоже нам 2 слова в заключение. Когда мы сможем посмотреть и получить книгу господина Гилберта Докторова в нашей библиотеке?
Вот, во-первых, огромное спасибо аудитории, большое спасибо за интересные вопросы, большое спасибо Гилберту Докторову за то, что вы так осветили. Мне, как человеку, который прожил тоже в 90-х, в лихих, мне было очень интересно услышать вот мнение со стороны, прямо это свое родное, и тоже у меня есть лично вопросы к вам, которые, наверное, я задам уже при встрече, когда вы сможете передать вашу книгу. Вот. И об этом мы с вами обязательно договоримся. Вот. Я буду ждать вас с нетерпением и с вопросами, и в ожидании ваших трудов, потому что действительно очень было интересно. Вот. Поэтому спасибо большое.
Спасибо, Мария. Спасибо коллегам, которые помогали технически обеспечить эту интернет-трансляцию. Спасибо нашим переводчикам, всегда прекрасным, которые нам тоже сегодня очень помогли. Господин Докторов, еще раз огромное спасибо вам, спасибо всей аудитории, и ждем вашу книгу, с удовольствием будем читать ее, и ждем ваших новых воспоминаний, потому что я думаю, что ваши воспоминания на самом деле неисчерпаемы, и вам есть еще очень много, что нам рассказать.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your kind words. I'm very appreciative of all of the efforts you've made to have this presentation go through this evening, and for all the technical support, and also for your kindness that you've shown me.
Спасибо. Дорогие друзья, спасибо, что были с нами. Сегодня с нами был господин Гилберт Докторов, политолог, историк, специалист по менеджмент-культуре и специалист по России, и его воспоминания о его жизни и работе в России в 90-е годы прошлого века. Приглашаем всех на другие акции Русского дома. В частности, приглашаем всех в понедельник на виртуальную экскурсию по главному космическому музею нашей страны, Московскому музею космонавтики, виртуальную экскурсию, которую мы посвящаем 60-летию первого полета человека в космос. Другие наши мероприятия, вся наша программа на сайте rushouse.be. В чате сейчас вы видите ссылки на книги, о которых мы сегодня говорили, том 1 и том 2 воспоминаний Гилберта Докторова. Всех приглашаем с ними познакомиться, их почитать. Спасибо всем. До свидания, до новых встреч на виртуальной площадке Русского дома в Брюсселе. Берегите себя.